Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. My name is Emily Winterbotham, and I am the Director of RUSI's Terrorism and Conflict Research Group. And I am delighted to welcome you to the sixth and final seminar in the series run in partnership between the Centre for the Study of Illicit Economies, Violence and Development, based at SOAS University, and RUSI. These seminars have explored illicit economies, violence and development, and are the inspiration of the CIVAD Centre, which aims to better understand the development and peace-building challenges presented by illicit economies. Its research explores the pathways through which illicit economies interact with the dynamics of conflict and development, and it works to identify policies for addressing illicit economies that help to build peace and promote more inclusive development. One of the key areas also for RUSI's Terrorism and Conflict Research Team, of which I am the director, is to better understand conflict and terrorism-related violence, and in particular how terrorist groups operate within and across conflict zones, including how they capitalize on illicit economies in order to better respond to, prevent and resolve terrorism and conflict. And, the need to understand the relationship between these interconnected areas has been recognized at the international level. In 2019, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 2482, expressing concern that terrorists can benefit from organized crime as a source of financing or logistical support. And they stressed the need for research on the links that may exist between terrorism, organized crime, and illicit finance. Speaking from my own experience in Afghanistan, when I used to explain the Taliban, for example, I used to describe them simultaneously operating as an insurgent group, a terrorist actor, and an organized criminal drugs mafia. And now they are the government. So, with that being said, a few housekeeping rules before I introduce our panelists. The event is entirely on record and is being recorded, including the discussion and the Q&A. The Q&A will remain open throughout the event, so please do feel free to include your questions in the chat throughout. We will have two presentations followed by a discussion. You may notice from the introduction that we were meant to have one more panelist, but unfortunately, Joana is in Cameroon and is experiencing poor internet connection, along with logistical and travel nightmares, I think. So we only have two speakers today, and what we will try and do is perhaps draw the event to a close slightly earlier than anticipated. We will still have a good hour of presentations, questions and discussions, but I may give you all 20 minutes or so back in your day. So now I would just like to introduce the panelists. We have with us today Dr. Keith Ditcham, who is Acting Director of the Organised Crime and Policing Team at RUSI. He has brought masses, 19 years of experience and thematic expertise in serious and organized crime. He's worked in North and Central America and in Europe, and his expertise includes counter-narcotics and associated money laundering, anti-bribery and corruption investigations, human trafficking, illegal immigration, fraud, and firearms trafficking. And Keith is going to focus on the criminal convergence in Latin America in his presentation. Our second speaker is Dr. Hans-Jakob Schindler, who is Senior Director at the Counter-Extremism Project in New York and Berlin, and holds masses of other senior positions. I'm not going to list them all, but I think of relevance for his presentation today. In 2013, he joined the ISIL, Al-Qaeda, and Taliban sanctions monitoring team of the UN Security Council and served as the team's coordinator from 2015 to 2018. Throughout his career, he's advised government leaders and top executives in Europe, North America, and internationally on issues concerning international terrorism, financial crime, sanctions, and combating the financing of terrorism and extremism. And Hans is going to focus on Afghanistan in his presentation. So that's it from me. I am now going to hand over to Dr. Keith Ditcham to kick us off. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are as well. Thank you for the introduction, Emily. I shall just wait for my slides to load, please, Danielle, if you wouldn't mind, and then make a start. But just whilst I'm waiting for that, I originally started my career in Kent Police before getting the opportunity to go and work overseas, and I spent then most of my law enforcement career based in the Netherlands, in Spain, and in Colombia, and also had responsibility at various times for various posts in Western Europe and also in the Latin and South America as well. So I feel reasonably well qualified to talk about some of these subjects, and myself and a colleague, Martin Pereira, who's an associate fellow of RUSI, recently published a book chapter on the consolidation of criminal convergence in South America. The next slide, please. Okay, so just starting talking about, sorry, can I have the next slide, please, Danielle? Thank you very much. So 38 of the 50 most violent cities in the world are currently in Latin America. These are in countries that are highly affected by drug trafficking, such as Mexico, Colombia, and Brazil, where criminal violence generates productivity costs aimed at estimated, at about 3.5% of gross domestic product. Much of this violence is especially associated with the trafficking of cocaine, which is produced and consumed locally and re-exported mostly by sea to high-value markets in the world, reaching a record 1,784 tons of annual production. This expansive period of drug trafficking enhances the actions of organised crime, facilitating a phenomenon of growing concern, and that is the confluence of criminal convergence, which I wish to talk about today. This criminal convergence operates on three levels. Firstly, on the routes used between criminal organisations, on the routes used, then secondly, between criminal organisations locally and intercontinental, and then lastly, in areas of low governance that are exploited by non-state threats such as terrorism. Various illegal goods are frequently trafficked together or move through the same transit routes. For example, timber and gold are often moved across the Atlantic to Europe alongside cocaine. This phenomenon coincides with the development of alliances between criminal groups for mutual benefit, as evident in the spread of Mexican and Colombian drug trafficking organisations abroad and their convergence with the most relevant European criminal organisations, such as the mafia, but also terrorist organisations eager to obtain sources of financing. Next slide, please. While cocaine has traditionally flowed from major producing countries such as Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia to North America or Europe, increased production and police pressure on key routes have led to the emergence of new markets in Russia and Asia, while cocaine production in Colombia has shifted much of the production from Peru and Bolivia to the south, especially to ports in Ecuador, Brazil, and Paraguay. And this diversification of this trafficking to other regions has opened new conversion points in smuggling routes of different goods, including gold and timber of illegal origin, but also weapons and tobacco. These trafficking routes do not only operate in single geographical directions, but usually connect different regions and continents through traffic in both directions, going south and north and east and west. In many cases, the numerous and voluminous export routes of commodities and their difficulty to be controlled locally are exploited for trafficking, not only in narcotics, but also the illegally extracted goods, as I mentioned before, such as gold and timber. The relationship between criminal organisations dedicated to drug trafficking and the exploitation of gold and timber is direct, since usually the same areas in Peru and Colombia dedicated to the culture of coca plants match with areas of mining, exploitation of forest resources. Likewise, the ease of money laundering through gold mines and the increase in the price in recent years has attracted the attention of drug trafficking organisations who have ventured into this strategy, especially in Colombia, Venezuela, and Ecuador. In this context, gold is also used by these organisations to launder the financial proceeds of drug trafficking. Venezuela plays a fundamental role as an intermediate country in this trafficking, with criminal organizations that export gold to destinations with low controls of legality of the origin of the mentioned material, such as the United Arab Emirates, Aruba, Curacao, Bonaire, and Uganda. I'd have the next slide, please. Illegally harvested timber also offers drug traffickers an additional resource of financing and a means to hide shipments. Frequently, illegally harvested timber is washed and provided with documentation that legalizes it, thus enabling its commercialization to the rest of the world. The timber transported by river and road has been used to move cocaine through South America. And this is particularly the case with the movement of wood down the Amazon River to the port of Belém do Pará in Brazil. Often legal or illegal timber is used to hide or disguise cocaine. And this methodology has also occurred in transatlantic shipments of timber. For example, shipments of 1.3 tons of cocaine were found inside a container full of wooden briquettes from Brazil, shipped from Brazil in Hamburg in Germany. And more recently, a shipment of 7.2 tons of cocaine were found hidden in wood inside a container in Antwerp. The need for criminal organizations to arm themselves too also fosters the convergence of drugs and other goods, other routes of goods trafficking with those for weapons. The relationship between arms trafficking and drug trafficking is direct, as criminal organizations feed on them to confront other organizations, establish internal control, and sometimes confront state agencies. For example, in 2018, an arms trafficking operation was detected from the United States and Europe to Argentina, and from there to Paraguay and Brazil, to supply the Brazilian criminal group, the Primeiro Comando Capital, PCC, using the same cocaine and marijuana trafficking routes. As with Mexico's illegal arms trade, the southern states of the United States are the source of most of the weapons circulating in Latin America, being trafficked along the same cocaine routes, but also downwards. It is estimated that around 200,000 weapons enter Mexico from the United States, and from there, many of them end up in Central and South America. This convergence in transnational criminal trafficking also matches with money laundering operations, explains the phenomenon of cash trafficking using the same routes used to traffic other illicit goods. According to the Basel Institute on Governance, Paraguay, Bolivia, and Venezuela are the countries considered most vulnerable to money laundering in South America, while the US State Department identified Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Ecuador, Paraguay, Peru, and Venezuela as the top money laundering jurisdictions. According to the same report, the tri-border area shared with Brazil and Paraguay is one of the main routes to Argentina for multi-billion-dollar money laundering based on trade and other criminal activities. And according to GAFILAT report, the most recent recurrent money laundering schemes in the financial sector include private banking, financial instruments, remittances, and exchange businesses, while money laundering outside the financial sector includes real estate, import and sell of luxury cars, the trade in jewelry and precious stones, as well as agricultural activities. Money laundering frequently involves bulk cash transfers, including on transatlantic routes. If I could have the next slide, please. So around the criminal convergence among criminal organizations, the convergence in trafficking routes is fed by criminal convergence between criminal organizations. This criminal convergence occurs because of the growing interconnection between various criminal organizations, where each of them provide a comparative advantage. These can either be geographical domain or over the trafficking or some substance or the provision of illegal services such as money laundering. Colombia's criminal organizations were some of the first to converge with others at the regional level. In the 80s, Colombian cartels relied heavily on the provision of other actors located in Bolivia and Peru. And currently, Mexican cartels dominate the scene, converging with local actors, especially in those countries located on the axis of the Andes Mountains. In Colombia, Mexico's Sinaloa cartel has established alliances with Los Urabeños to send cocaine shipments to Europe and other areas. And this cartel has also operated in other countries in South America. In a similar case of transatlantic convergence, in Ecuador, Albanian criminal organizations have been identified operating in Ecuadorian ports, coordinating shipments of cocaine smuggled from Colombia by local organizations. One of the main Albanian drug traffickers, Arba CIVAD was responsible for a total of 108 shipments of cocaine disguised in banana shipments to Albania. He in person supervised departures from the port. This organization has strengthened linkages with organizations operating in the Colombia's border area, especially in Sucumbíos. One of the most concerning variants of criminal convergence, however, occurs when organizations dedicated to drug trafficking converge with those linked to terrorism. For example, in Paraguay, drug trafficking organizations operating from Ciudad del Este also have strong linkages with money launderers and terrorist financing. The criminal nature of the tri-border and its extensive money laundering opportunities facilitated the installation of criminal groups that have been specializing in other criminal activities, including Hezbollah, which has been present in the tri-frontiers since the mid-1980s. Hezbollah's operations in the area include drug trafficking, currency counterfeiting, and organized crime to fund operations around the world. In 2018, Paraguayan authorities arrested Nader Mohamed Farhad, a currency trader from Ciudad del Este, investigated by the Drug Enforcement Agency for drug trafficking and money laundering. Its operations include the use of the exchange house, Unique SA, and at least 8 banks in Paraguay from where money was transferred abroad. At the time of his arrest, $1.4 million in cash was confiscated from his home. And more recently, in August 2021, local authorities in Ciudad del Este arrested Qasim Mohamed Hijazi, a Lebanese-Brazilian accused of money laundering for drug trafficking organization. The link between money laundering and drug trafficking actors is most obvious in the case of Hezbollah, who started to be involved in cocaine trafficking in the region. And the expansion of Hezbollah needed the cooperation and collaboration of national organizations that could secure the supply of cocaine. This is done providing money laundering services to less sophisticated criminal organizations like the PCC that have access to the cocaine supply chain. And the relationship with the PCC goes beyond money laundering. Hezbollah has also acted as a shadow facilitator, helping the PCC acquire firearms to protect Hezbollah operatives incarcerated in Brazilian prisons. I've had the next slide, please. So on the criminal convergence in failed spaces and areas, often in many parts in Latin America, criminal activity promotes and generates an area of illegality that naturally displaces the presence of the state. Consequently, a vicious circle is generated where criminal groups are strengthened and the state is weakened, which further enhances the actions of organized crime and thus facilitating criminal convergence in these areas. These spaces or areas are usually places located on the borders, but they can also be vulnerable neighborhoods in large cities. However, large geographical areas are not the only ones that act as facilitators of criminal convergence, since prisons and ports also function as facilitators of this convergence. In recent years, some border points in Latin America have been transformed into places where state governance is diffuse and where organized crime has become entrenched. In these places converge criminal organizations, trafficking routes, and territorial occupation. Two of the most emblematic places are located on the border between Ecuador and Colombia, as well as on the triple border between Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay. So we've come to the next slide, which should hopefully then be my 2 slides on conclusions. So South America is going through the golden age of criminal convergence. Just as old smuggling channels allowed the expansion of cocaine trafficking, today it strengthens and enables the trafficking of other illegal goods. In this scenario, the role of local facilitators and so-called super facilitators operating in hubs of illegality, operating with traffickers of arms, drugs, natural resources, and getting involved in terrorist financing operations allows the interconnection between them. The convergence between criminal organizations forces us to revise theories that frame criminal organizations as actors, tending to confront others in the bidding for dominance of a given market. The role of organized crime enhancers offered by areas of low governance, whether border cities or prisons, allows criminal organizations to escalate in the use of armed violence and criminal structure, corrupting and penetrating and co-opting the institutional structures of the state. Next slide, please. So these places are the same that are exploited by parastatal actors, terrorist organizations, and narco-insurgencies, strengthening themselves. In this context, the state and particularly police forces, usually slow in response, bureaucratic in their organisation and top-down in their formation, must necessarily transform themselves if they want to successfully confront this new phenomenon. The problem of origin lies in the absence of the state, the lack of sovereign control or effective exercise of sovereignty, which in turn enables the possibility for criminal organisations to dominate a trafficking route, a city, a prison or a port. Therefore, any strategy that seeks to contain and successfully attack organised crime in these places must be developed as a multi-agency strategy, where the police are but one element in a set of interventions that include the development of opportunities for disadvantaged populations, the structural improvement of penitentiaries, and the improvement of controls at various ports as well. I think that should be my last slide, and that should be me done. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Keith. And I think, demonstrating how your presentation was on Latin America, but actually how much further these networks and interconnections go and how far back actually they're rooted. This is not a new phenomenon by any stretch. I think that leads us nicely into the presentation by Dr. Hans-Jakob Schindler, who will take us to a different context, which connects, I'm sure, with all of the things we've heard before. So over to you, Hans.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this. Thank you, of course, to RUSI for the invitation. I'm really glad to be here. Yeah, this is where I would argue the convergence is done, and it really never happened. So you have now a extremist organization which has a criminal financing system being in charge of the government. But before I start, let me just say a couple of sentences about my organization, in case some of you are not familiar with us yet. The Counter-Extremism Project is a transatlantic, fully privately funded research and advocacy organization that works on a wide range of violent extremist and terrorist phenomena, so from violent right-wing extremism to Islamist terrorism. The distinguishing factor why we look at certain groups and other groups is their relationship to violence, which has to be direct or at least very directly indirect for us to look at them. We have our main offices in New York, where I join you from today, and our European offices in Berlin. But of course, we have representatives in Washington, London, Brussels, in Dublin, and we have a strategic partnership with Globsec for our work in Central and Eastern Europe. We work, and that's why we have people in all of these places, of course, with a range of governments in North America, as well as in Europe, as well as at the level of the European Union, in particular, the European Counterterrorism Coordinator. Today, as was already mentioned, I will look at the Taliban and their relationship to organized crime, in particular, the massive drug trade that happens in Afghanistan. I'll go first a little bit into the historical involvement, because there has always been a discussion of how far the Taliban are or are not involved in this trade, and I'll point out a few things that make it clear that they've always been and always will be involved. Then I'll look at the current situation, in particular, where do we see growth and harvest patterns and price patterns go? And then I'll look at the risk of money laundering operations and bring a historical example to show you how sophisticated it was when it was fully under the control of Western nations in Afghanistan. So let me start with the historical involvement. As I said, there is a very vibrant expert debate, some claiming that the Taliban are not really that involved. The problem is that it is a historical connection. Even when the movement was founded, the starting capital for the movement to take off in the very early 1990s came from 3 drug trafficking networks of the Nurzai tribe. That's not me or CP or the UN saying that. That's actually Taliban biographies pointing that out. This connection continued, right? And throughout the 20 years, and I'll show you some maps to make this point clear, from 2021 till 2020, from 2001 till 2021, drugs continued to be the main income stream of the Taliban. Now you can have a large discussion whether this was that much or this much. And of course, there was also the involvement directly and indirectly of the illegal exploitation of natural resources. Of course, there was widespread extortion, but this was the one constant in Taliban finances. Mining came up later, extortion went up and down with territorial control, but illegal drugs trafficking always was a staple of their finances. In case you were any doubt whether the Taliban 2.0 don't care about these relationships, you had the exchange of these two individuals. So the individual on the left is a guy called Mark Frerichs, who was abducted by the Haqqani network in 2000, and he was exchanged in 2022 against Haji Bashir Nursai, who had spent a considerable amount of his life at that point already in an American jail as a main trafficker, drug trafficker, because called Kingpin, because Haji Bashir Nursai was one of the three key financiers that gave the Taliban money to establish the movement. So, you know, although he wasn't really helpful for the Taliban for a very long time, they still felt they had to get him out of prison. They could have asked for anyone else, and there are multiple Afghans in prison at this time in America, but they asked for this particular guy to exchange against this particular high-value hostage that the Haqqani network had. So that, I guess, tells a very interesting story. On a how much was this actually involved? And these maps is the last map in 2021. I could have done this, and we've done this in the UN every single year between 2001 and 2021. And there was a very simple formula where you had an increase, and this is the Taliban control. So you saw where it increased in 2021, where you had an increase in Taliban control, you had an increase in drug production. This is the UN map showing you where drug production significantly increased in 2021. And that near 90% correlation between Taliban territorial control in Afghanistan and the expansion of poppy cultivation, and including, I'll get to this later, methamphetamine production, was a constant. Of course, there were criminal networks that also route and transported and sold drugs. Of course, the Afghan Republic government was also in a major way involved in the drug in the cultivation and transporting of drugs. But the Taliban, when they were not part of the actual network, made sure that they had the access road from and to the fields, the access road from and to the laboratories, and the trafficking routes out of the country, out of their control. So if they weren't able to directly earn the money, they earned it through the fees that were charging whoever else was growing drugs in Afghanistan and trying to put it into a laboratory or transport the finished product out of the country. So there was a multi-layered system in which they earned their money. Of course, much has been made about the ideological problem that the Taliban had with the drugs. Now, there is absolutely, it's true, the Taliban issued so far not one, but 3 bans against the drugs. The first one was actually in 1999, right, where a general poppy ban cultivation was announced by the Taliban. As you can see, this had the effect that the production increased. Then in 2000, Mullah Omar issued a decree verbatim saying plow under all the poppy plants in the country, which led to a slight drop in the production. And the only time where it really dropped is when the Taliban lost power in 2001. So anyone who had great hopes that the April 2022 drug ban of the Taliban would have a significant effect in the drug production is slowly waking up to the fact that we see a similar system that we saw in 2000. In the early 2000s, the Taliban are on the public side ideologically opposed against drugs use. On the financial side, they are absolutely continue to depend on the poppy production. Now you can have a long and very philosophic discussion whether sanctions play a role and the Taliban don't have a chance to grow the other economy, and whether it's at all possible to leave anyone off the drugs. 20 years of attempts by the international community under UK lead, under Japanese lead, under US lead, really brought home the fact that there is an intricate systems that makes the farmers economically dependent on the drug networks. And therefore, if you try to disrupt this economy, you're disrupting a massive part of people's livelihoods on the one hand, and the Taliban, in a very interesting scheme, always were able to exploit this drug production also to generate fighters. Because one of the tragic aspects of the poppy production from a farmer's perspective is that you cannot grow new poppies on the seed of old poppies. You need to buy the seeds, and the Taliban were happy to provide the seeds plus a cash credit on the expected yield of the field of the farmer. That cash credit was purposefully always calculated above any potential high maximum yield of the farm. And then the farmer, between the poppy growing seasons, was not necessarily ideologically very much supporting the Taliban, but he certainly was fighting for the Taliban because he was basically, through his fighting, paying off the credits that the Taliban had afforded him, the difference between his yield and the cash credit that he got for his family. Hence, there was this really stable 10,000 people that got killed every time on the Taliban side in each fighting season, never really led to a particular big drop in Taliban fighters on the field, fighting season after fighting season, because most of those individuals, or at least a significant part of those individuals, weren't there because they were there for ideological reasons, they were there for commercial reasons. Now, let's have a look on how the drug cultivation in 2022 developed, according to the UN, who in November released its report. So we saw a slight decrease in the production. Here it says 32 degrees by 32%, but that's against the drop of the heavy fighting in Afghanistan. And we saw a massive increase in prices. So by issuing the poppy ban, the Taliban in fact actually made sure that the next harvest is actually more valuable than the last harvest. So it was a wonderful cash windfall. Why do we not see this on the streets of Europe at this point? Why is there not an absolutely expensive heroin consumption here on our streets? It's because it takes 1.5 years from Afghanistan to actually reach the streets. So by the end of this year, the beginning of next year, we should see an increase in international heroin prices. But Afghanistan also has a second problem, and this is also started during the last years of the Taliban and will definitely continue, because Afghanistan has one absolute distinct market advantage when it comes to the production of amphetamine. And here you can just see when this was discovered, what happened in Afghanistan, right? So you had nothing seized, and then all of a sudden in 2019 it explodes, because in 2019 some very smart farmers got an idea how you get around the one thing that makes the production of methamphetamine very difficult. Most of the other chemicals are household chemicals. You can direct, you can get them, they are not really that controlled. One thing is 100% control, and that's ephedrine. That's why you see these kind of individual meth labs here buying cough medicine and pain medicine to get the ephedrine out of the medication. Very difficult, very highly controlled substance. However, Afghanistan is the only country where you can actually get ephedrine out of a natural resource. It's the Oman bushel, or the ephedra plant, grows in Afghanistan in altitudes above 2,000 meters, which is essentially all of central Afghanistan. And if you look at the overlap between where the ephedrine production areas were growing in 2019, 20, and 21, and where the Taliban control was growing, you come to the absolute same picture. When the Taliban started their ephedrine production, or gained control in the areas, ephedrine production and methamphetamine production spiked. And by the way, methamphetamine, in my opinion, is the future of Taliban drug production, because all you need is these Oman bushels that grow naturally, plus a laboratory and household chemicals. That means if you want to do remote sensing, what the UN does very well and over many years developed by satellite imagery and thermal imagery, where are the poppy grounds in Afghanistan? Methamphetamine, you need to know where the lab is. And Afghanistan is anything but a small country, and it's a very underdeveloped country. So you can put a laboratory that puts out kilos of methamphetamine a day in areas where it's very, very unlikely with remote sensing that you find it, unless you have sources on the ground. And guess what? We all just left our sources behind and lost massive trust with our sources in Afghanistan in August 2021. So not the best of starting points when this country actually has a distinct market advantage against the rest of the world when it comes to methamphetamine. So the Taliban can even claim that they eradicated poppy production and still earn more money with methamphetamine than they earn with heroin, because the production profit margin of methamphetamine is higher than that of heroin, if you believe that. Why I think they're not going to give this up is this one. This is a painstakingly established global distribution network for drugs flowing out of Afghanistan managed by the Taliban, including, as you can see, Australia. Why Australia? We discovered while I was still at the UN a extremely interesting money laundering operation there, where the Taliban simply approached families of individuals living in Australia, in Afghanistan, and made them a very interesting offer. We'll give you at least $500,000 Australian dollars in Australia. You buy a house for your family. You can live in that house for free. And however, when we need the money, you will have to sell the house. Many Afghan refugees in Sydney in particular, and this is how it actually popped up, took up that offer. And then you had all of a sudden streets in Sydney that were owned by Afghan refugees who had no conceivable way to have earned $500,000 Australian dollars in their lifetime. And that's how it became obvious that something was fishy going on, and that the actual Taliban in Afghanistan had set up a trans-Pacific money laundering operations focused on Australia, which is also one of the countries that they supply the product to. Then you have these complex supply chains via Africa. As you can see, if you look at all the bubbles in the middle of the continent, that happens also just to be the areas where you have a growth in Al-Qaeda, Jinim, the growth of the Islamic State Greater Sahara, the growth of the Islamic State West Sahara, the West Africa province, the growth of Islamic State Central Africa province, and on the other side you have Al-Shabaab, another Al-Qaeda affiliate. So perfect area to transport your product through and make sure that governments are not going to touch your product, because large parts of this West African and Sahel zone, and increasingly Somalia, are simply no longer under the control of the government. A very neglected counterterrorism threat, in my opinion, in European eyes. Now, why I think money laundering is remaining a massive problem is this is what I've talked about. This is something that popped up in 2014, where OFAC sanctioned those individuals. By the way, one of those individuals was at the time on the Taliban sanctions list of the United Nations Security Council. Now, the clue is this network set up 3 companies, beverages, food packaging, in export in Afghanistan, a money exchanger in an export business in the UAE, right? And because it was in the food bottling business, it was the main supplier of bottled water to the US forces in Kandahar, as well as to the UN in Kandahar, without anyone realizing that hundreds of millions of US dollars were laundered through this network. Why is this so important to talk about this when something happened in 2014? Because this was discovered under the best of circumstances in Afghanistan. This is when you had a massive amount of troops. This is just on the peak of a search. And you had Shafov Yot, a dedicated unit within the military forces, dedicated only to the prevention of corruption and money laundering. Now, under all of these control mechanisms, the Taliban were still being able to set up all of these companies and launder for many years money through them, and B, become the main suppliers of beverages to the US forces who were investigating money laundering, and the UN at the same time. And no one realized until luckily some mistake happened on the Etemad Beverage Company Limited side that actually allowed this network to be investigated. So this is when we had eyes in Afghanistan. Now we essentially don't have eyes in Afghanistan. If you're looking at where is the money flowing, there are some primary and some secondary flows. So here's the map. So primary flows, of course, to Pakistan, and then from Pakistan to the Emirates, and then out, directly to the Emirates and out, and to a much smaller extent also direction Turkey, because these are countries where you have actually a functioning banking system. And when you're dealing with drug money the size of Afghanistan, you don't do this by Havaladars. Of course, Havaladars play a role, but you try to send $100 million every 6 months via Havaladar, you will have a lot of work on your hand, and it will be very obvious. So sooner or later, this money needs to enter the formal financial systems, and these are the jurisdictions that are most at risk where this is actually going to happen, because, of course, the Afghan banking system wasn't a great banking system, had no correspondence bankings, even prior to 2021, but now it's absolutely cut off. So they have to get the money out. Secondary money flows towards Qatar, of course, right, as Central Asia, and of course, Iran. So these are the jurisdictions where there really should be more action of the FATF, the Edmund Group, to make sure that we have greater financial transparency, the old argument that you need to take care better of the free ports and the free trade zones in the Gulf region and all of the issues. But if there is no other reason, this is a massive money laundering operation that is going on. And if we don't get greater transparency and better controls and political will to do so, at least in the Gulf states and Turkey, then we will have a continuous problem on our hands and absolutely no hope that the Taliban would ever want to go away from drug production as part of their production. So now this is just the point that while the Taliban had to do this as part of the economy, they had to misuse some parts of the economy to do this. They had to extort or force companies to cooperate. Now this is all done. Now the Taliban actually have the control over the Afghan economy. That means any company in Afghanistan is now at risk of being pressured by the Taliban into cooperating. And there are still a couple of very high-ranking members. The first deputy prime minister, the political deputy prime minister are, according to the UN, which is the most credible data that you can get, because it's actually vetted by the 15 members of the Security Council involved in drug dealing. Therefore, as the economic activities slowly resume, and they are on a much smaller scale, it's still a very broken economy, there is still a lot of problems, there is abject hunger and poverty in the country, but there's also humanitarian flows that are restarting. There is an economic activity. The Taliban actually restored imports and they increased exports compared to 2021. So as this goes on, the opportunities to launder the money will no longer require the Taliban to set up some shell companies in Afghanistan and deliver water to anyone. They can simply use the already existing economic activities. And this part of this of my presentation I wanted to transfer into discussion is what are the potential control mechanisms that we have to deal with all of this. Thank you so much. That concludes my presentation, and I'm looking forward to questions.
Thank you, Hans. It doesn't necessarily leave us on an optimistic note, but as we all know, anything related to Afghanistan.
Optimism from Afghanistan, you're talking about the wrong country.
Yeah, nothing that relates to Afghanistan these days is positive whatsoever. What I just quickly want to do before I turn to a first question to the panelists is, I know there was a flurry of questions from Rafael Moreto and really helpful comments, and thank you for your interest in RUSI. I'm going to ask a specific question, trying to summarize, I think, some of what you've said to both panelists, but also just to respond in terms of how RUSI operates and how we get our information and how we feel that we are able to do credible research. We absolutely work with local researchers and local research teams. If I look at our work in East Africa in particular, we have an office there. So really grateful for your enthusiasm for what we do, and feel free to reach out separately on that. But I think just to kind of distill down one of your questions so that I have time for the other questions, there was a question around that the global nature of this threat and the fact that all of these issues are connected, they're transnational, and what is the need for some form of global joint task force to really get a grip of this problem. So I'll put it out to both of you. Let's perhaps start with Keith and then go to Hans. Over to you, Keith.
Yeah, I delivered a presentation to a group last night, and they were trying to form some policy around what they might do should they come into power in the UK around law enforcement cooperation. And my view is it's still quite siloed. And if you listen to what was some of the content of my presentation, but also that of my co-presenter, Dr. Hans, that there's a lot of convergence between various activities as well. In many cases, those involved are known, but the law enforcement response tends to be a very sort of siloed approach in relation to various sort of sort of a taxonomy, if you like, of criminal offences rather than looking at the individual. Now, in some cases, that is because jurisdictions are hidebound by their legislation and there's very little else they can do. In others, they perhaps have a little bit more leeway as well. So in terms of a global task force, I think it's difficult because of how could you get around those issues? If I think back to some of my experience when I was based in the Netherlands, I didn't work at Europol. I was a bilateral liaison officer, but I worked very closely with Europol and the joint investigation teams. They've come a long way since they were first introduced, and they're a really good idea. And they certainly are a real asset when conducting multi-jurisdictional investigations, putting prosecutors in contact with prosecutors as well, perhaps through the just mechanism. But to have a sort of truly global task force and to get around all those legal, policy, practice, skills, cultures, that would probably mean that the organisation would become too inward focused on trying to deal with those issues rather than trying to deal with the criminality. So I think that I wouldn't poo-poo it because you never know, there might be an employment opportunity there in the future. But I'm not entirely sure that that's the right response at the moment. I think international cooperation works quite well, but I think that there's yet more that can be done. And my experience in many years as a liaison officer and as a regional director of liaison officers is, yes, you need to comply with the law, you need legal and policy implications, and they have to be in place, but it's personal relationships that make things happen, and I think the strength of those are key in fostering international cooperation. Hans.
Yeah, look, I agree. I mean, and this is always easy to call for global task forces. It sounds good, right? It's practically impossible, but also it really doesn't help you if you don't have the visibility on the problem. So soft law approaches like FATF recommendations are usually actually far more impactful. So for example, until very recently in the UAE, money laundering was not considered a crime unless the crime for which the money was laundered was committed on UAE soil, which of course made the UAE a very attractive point where money was laundered, because, you know, as long as you didn't sell the drugs in the UAE, you were not actually falling under the respective money laundering operation legislation. So you need to have the basis on which you can jointly investigate, and also you need to have the visibility. So the problem here is you do have investigations and databases and statistics focused on organized crime, and then you have investigations and databases and statistics focused on terrorist movements and extremists. This is only the information pillars that you have, but behind those pillars are actually investigative capabilities, legal requirements, actual physical investigators. Cases like the Taliban, where you have an extremist organization that is also running a government, that is also doing money laundering, are falling between all of those tracks. So now what are they? They are all of these aboves. But in order to understand fully and to see how, for example, political relationships can be exploited towards money laundering purposes, right? Or how a government, like the government of Pakistan, there was a question there, could have a forex shortage, but still allow money flowing through. So the forex shortage is not an argument that money doesn't flow through Pakistan, because the money doesn't stay in Pakistan. It would only be an argument if I would have argued that the Taliban bunker their money in Pakistan, but they do understand that the Pakistani economy is not the one that you want to invest in. It flows through. So it can be equally true that you have a forex shortage in the country and you have money flowing through the country. So in order to do this, you have to have a different approach before you think about task forces. You need the regulations in place that you actually allow you to see the problem. Then you have to have a top-level political decision in which way you want to treat the problem. So is this a crime problem? Is this a terror problem? Is this a weird government that we have to deal diplomatically with, or all of the above? And then you have to combine the various expertise, which is a very difficult legal thing to do, because with those areas of responsibility, you have vastly different mandates of what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. For example, in Germany, we have a category extremism in our security regulations, which means the German intelligence service is able to not only investigate terrorist as it is in the UK, but also extremist organizations that have not yet officially classified as terrorists. However, when it comes to the money, they can only investigate extremist organizations that have a connection to violence, right? So there are hurdles to overcome here. It's not quite as easy as it sounds, but if it would all work, of course, global cooperation, information exchange would help.
Thank you. Really comprehensive answers from both of you. I'm going to turn now to a question from Stephen Reimer, who is a RUSI research fellow. And he's interested in the use of crime, which he defines as terrorists working with criminals or terrorists adopting criminal tactics for terrorism financing in Europe, on the basis that his hypothesis is that Europe is mainly an illicit economic staging ground for terrorist activity outside Europe. Would you agree? I will go to you again, Keith, first. Sorry for starting you first, but Hans has just spoken.
He probably needs a break as well. Yes. Quick sip of water. Thank you, Stephen. Sorry for your question. I mean, terrorism is not an area of where I've spent much of my career focused, and the structure within the National Crime Agency and with policing has been somewhat in the past fragmented, of dealing with organised crime and terrorism as separate things, and obviously some of what we've been talking about today is around that sort of those links and that convergence. So I won't claim to be a caveat anything I say by the fact that I'm not an expert on terrorism. However, I do tend to agree with you. I think that we've seen. If I think back 10 odd years ago when I was running the Americas region and studying for my master's, there was a very sort of purist view around terrorism as a sort of ideological driver of activity, whereas organised crime predominantly driven by greed, and therefore they were if you like, opposite ends of a criminal sort of spectrum. I don't think that that's necessarily the case, and that's not to say that there may be terrorist organizations and criminal organizations that will still fit very neatly into that sort of completely opposing ideologies around why those involved do what they do. But primarily we've seen greater collaboration, we've seen greater convergence, we've seen terrorist organizations needing to fund their operations through the conduct of illicit activity, whether that be drug trafficking, human trafficking, or other forms, being able to launder their proceeds as well. As I mentioned in my presentation, albeit largely concentrating on Hezbollah because that's been the longest known relationship, but I think there are many others as well. And if you think about some of the insurgents and belligerent actors within Colombia itself and other Latin American countries, then that sort of the blurring between organised crime and terrorism is quite high. The extent to which activities are conducted in Europe in order to facilitate other activities outside, as I say, I would be hazarding a guess at that, and probably therefore not the right person to speak with any great confidence on that. And I apologise, I can't say much more than that. So,
Hans, any reflections from your side?
2 points here. So on the terrorism crime convergence, I was involved already in 2012 in a report that demonstrated that this is a natural occurrence, that you do have, of course, for financing purpose, a range of activities, whether you provide services or whether you get services, whether you are transforming into a hybrid organization. The IRA is one point, the Hezbollah is one point. Other groups have done this. The Taliban never been anything but a hybrid organization. It is really that the range is there, and this is not really geographically connected. I agree that Europe, because of our economy and the ability to raise funds here and make money here, is an important financing point globally for terrorist activities outside Europe, including money flows from Western Europe into Western Africa. However, I want to put one caution. because we were, when I was still at the German government, falling a little bit into these fallacies in the late 90s and the early 2000s. The idea was, if people recruit here, if people make their money here, last thing is they want to blow up things here. So this should not lead us again into assumptions that the terrorist threat of Europe, which at the moment is lower because we see lower attacks because West Africa is reorganizing, Middle East is a little bit better, Afghanistan is yet to show his wonderful new location as a terrorist harbor in the future. This should not lead us again to the assumption that because they want to make money here, they want to get their supporters here, that they wouldn't in a heartbeat turn around and attack us. That, I think, over the last 20 years have been conclusively proven. So yes, they do attack the place where they make money, but they also make money here.
Thank you, Hans. I'm going to actually just, if you don't mind, stick with you for a second, because I know that in your previous, in fact, maybe you said it even during the presentation itself, you were talking about the Hawala system not necessarily being as significant in this scale of illicit financing we see, but we did have a question about the connection between Hawala and organized crime and the Taliban. So I just wondered if you had any additional thoughts on that.
Well, maybe I was too short in my presentation to explain this properly. Of course, in Afghanistan, you have to do Hawala unless you don't want to transfer your money out. As I said, there is no real existing correspondent banking before 2021. Kabul bank scandal made this really an assured problem, but definitely not now. So there is no correspondent banking with Afghanistan. So you need to get it out. My argument was that once the money is out and you want to make it work for you, because the Taliban want eventually to get access to the money again, you're not going to Hawala it around the globe now. You are going to look for a good, safe access point into the financial system so that you, rather than moving smaller sums many times, from that point onwards, you can then invest in companies, make offers to Afghan refugees in Australia, open, this is not a joke, open a Swiss bank account to put all of your loot in that you took with you in 2001, something that you discovered a couple of years later, right? This is not going to happen if you Hawala your money into Zurich. You have to have a bank transfer, and then a Swiss bank will, of course, open you a numbered bank account if you have 100 or 200 million dollars to spend. But it's not going to be the Taliban of Afghanistan with a turban, but it's going to be a European lawyer who does it for you, who you also have to pay, and you're also not going to Hawala to. So you have to have the connection to the financial system once you start managing after having made the money.
Great, thank you. Keith, back to you. There was a question about popularity and adoption of cryptocurrencies and their role in money laundering schemes. Have you come across this in your research?
Yes, I have. I think there's a couple of things I would say about them. I mean, cryptocurrency as a means of obfuscating the origins of the money would appear on the face of it to be quite an attractive proposition for criminals and terrorist organizations to use. In a report published by Europol in 2 years now, 2021, they did comment on the uptake of this payment medium was accelerating. However, the overall number and value of cryptocurrency transactions related to criminal activities, they argue, still represent only a limited share of the criminal economy when compared to cash and other forms of transactions. I think part of this is because of the high volatility in cryptocurrencies. So yes, there's an uptake, but it's still cash and other means are still by far the most popular. They've seen its use wider than perhaps just in cybercrime as well, but moving into other forms of paying for other criminal activities. So it's not primarily confined to cybercrime activities, but other crimes that require the transmission of sort of money, monetary value. But again, the scale of it and the share of it is actually quite difficult to estimate, as so many things in this murky world are. But again, they conclude that traditional fiat money and transactions to a large degree still dominate the market. So I think it's a place to watch, but I think the volatility of it, uncertainty, perhaps established means of laundering cash means that at the moment I wouldn't say it's completely replaced other forms of currency, and it doesn't seem in the short term to be set to do that either.
Thank you. Just sticking with you, there was also a question around drug trafficking and using gold mines as an attractive means to launder money, and just a request for a bit more information, I think, on that area.
Yeah, well, gold is so what we've seen. I mean, earlier was in January. Yeah, it was middle to latter part of January. I was conducting research for the Home Office on the cocaine trade in the Caribbean, with a particular focus on the UK's interest, both overseas but also domestically as well. And two things that we noticed there. One was around the flows of money, where possible, if they can exchange that for gold, then that gets gold is a very stable form of monetary value, if you like. Point one. Point two, once converted into gold, it's very difficult then to establish the origins of that. So it's very attractive to organizations. I mentioned in my presentation around gold trafficking and cocaine sharing, converging and sharing the same routes, transatlantic routes as well. But within the Caribbean region as well, what we found is the form of exchange was cocaine at the local level for creepy, and creepy is a particular form of cannabis. So you don't always see monetary value, but you see other drugs being exchanged in return to feed a domestic supply, whilst the cocaine is then moved on for markets in America and in Europe and further afield as well, with emerging markets, as I said earlier, in Asia and in Russia and much further afield. So it probably is not going to come as any great surprise when I say that criminals will use any means possible, and they consider any kind of exchange for goods that can help them obfuscate the origins of their illicit gains, and to layer that into legitimate economy by the quickest and easiest means. And gold certainly seems to be an attractive way for them to do that.
Thank you very much for that. I mean, I'm noticing where we are with time, and I'm really grateful that we've had lots of great questions. I am going to turn to a question actually now about connecting dealers, and I think this is one that people are very interested in at the moment, in terms of the role of Wagner, Africa, the connection. And there was actually a question, I think, earlier as well about states' roles in this. We've talked about, non-state actors and terrorist groups and organized criminal groups, but where states connect into these, well, the connection between illicit finance, crime, terrorism, and obviously then there's a specific kind of case study example, I guess, in terms of Wagner. Hans, is it okay to put you on the spot with that one, and then Keith can jump in?
Yeah, but before that, a couple of things on the cryptocurrency argument. I agree, cash is still king with that, but as Keith knows, Europol doesn't actually investigate. It actually analyzes member state investigations and data that's provided. So no investigation, no data, no Europol statistics. The problem with cryptocurrencies, and why there is this argument gaining traction, that cryptocurrencies, after it was assumed they were, is no longer really that important on terrorism financing, is also due to some technical developments in cryptocurrencies. So when we talked about the first cryptocurrency generation, we talked about Bitcoin. The wallet is transparent, the blockchain is transparent. You can see what's going on from the outside. This is the most adopted, but also the least adopted cryptocurrency by terrorist and extremist organizations that we monitor at the Counter-Extremism Project. They've long moved away from Bitcoin because they know they can be investigated, and every single indictment in the US, which is the one country where it actually has a decent sized capability to investigate cryptocurrency crimes, have to do with Bitcoins, because privacy coins like Monero either encrypt the wallet and then no capability unless you have the key will open the wallet for you, so you don't know what's in the wallet, and others encrypt the wallet and the blockchain, Zcash. And guess which are the most prominent cryptocurrency privacy coins that ask for donations, for transfer of money by terrorist groups and extremist groups that we are looking at the moment. Hence, we do have a large part of what's going on that we simply do not see, because at the moment, the state capabilities are not there. It is still theoretically possible to figure out what's going on with cryptocurrency, with privacy coins, if you have the ability to figure out, and you have two chances, the on-ramping or the off-ramping. So fiat to crypto, crypto to currency. If you miss either one of those nodes, you have no idea whether this is terrorism, financing, criminality, or just a simple transaction. That is the current best case scenario. What, however, the next generation of cryptocurrency technology is doing, it's called non-custodial wallets and non-custodial exchanges, which neatly goes back to the idea of a completely user-based system and takes the intermediary out. At the moment, most of cryptocurrency transactions happen through exchanges. Now, if this exchange happens to be in a regulated jurisdiction like US or Europe, you can actually, and the US and Europe have done so, require the exchange to do KYC similar to what other normal fiat currency financial institutions would be doing. With non-custodial wallets and exchanges, which is shareware that someone programmed and that sit on the internet, you no longer have an intermediary, which means you cannot regulate your way out of this problem. Now, the two roads are, number one, the state becomes a truly big brother and has to see what everything is going on in this realm, or we just have to accept the fact that we now no longer have any visibility of anything and no one to ask the questions. So there is a large dark part, because what we see are indictments, what we see as actions of terrorist organizations. What we don't see is state indictments and statistic data with Interpol or Europol or some of these blockchain analysis companies making it public, because there is the technical and personal capability gap. Privacy coins, non-custodial wallets, and non-custodial exchanges are a major problem. And the absence of evidence in this case is definitely not the evidence of absence. Right, on the Wagner Group. We are about to gear up on a project looking at Russian right-wing extremist networks, of which Wagner will be one, and there's been a lot written about the Wagner as a PMC group, a private military company. We look at this as an extremist group. What is clear is the deals in Africa in particular are very simple. Wagner provides whatever services, mainly killing people, extrajudicially if possible, to the government that hires them, and get paid primarily in natural resources. We've not yet, and we just started this research, come across a great interlinkage between Wagner and drug flows in Africa. However, Wagner's story in West Africa, where a large part of European drugs land at the coastline and they get transported through North Africa into Europe, is just beginning. So they just have a presence in Mali. The coup government in Burkina Faso isn't quite sure whether they want to say or not say that they have Wagner, or maybe it's just Wagner trainers and not Wagner mercenaries. So the area where those drugs flow through, Wagner is just positioning itself. So I would not exclude that in the future, this is a business, these are ruthless people, that they would not also ask for a small fee of the drug transports that go through their area of control in that area.
Thank you. Great answer to the question. I'm going to just combine, if it's okay with the I guess, the attendees 2 questions, because I think it's important, because there was a question about illicit trade, money laundering, illicit finance is not only obviously a problem related to Islamist terrorism, but it's a problem that transcends communities. And then there was a kind of follow-up question about the role of white nationalist or far-right extremist organizations in illicit financing. And I wonder, Keith, given the existence of some of these groups and networks in Latin America, whether you had any insights into how this connects in terms of other forms of extremism.
Yeah, I think one of the key issues, and I sort of briefly touched on it in my presentation about the sort of weak state, but a weak state is a facilitator of the criminal convergence, but also, and we saw plenty of evidence of this when we were doing our cocaine threat assessment in the Caribbean recently, of corruption and corruption at the macro, but also at the micro scale as well. And where that happens, then it enables and it allows state actors and others to benefit immensely from illicit financial flows, to award contracts that are in theirs or their family's interest, to hide away money, to divert public funds, etc. as well, and it enables others, as I say, from turning a blind eye at the border to actually influencing politicians and others in order to vote in a particular way or act in a particular way, or to do something that's in the interest of a particular organization, whether it be a criminal or terrorist organization, is something that is quite pervasive and not necessarily be completely understood, I would argue, and secondly, not being particularly well tackled, primarily because invariably the law enforcement response in a lot of these countries is not sufficiently developed and not sufficiently robust to protect itself from that kind of influence and activity as well. And we've seen that in particular in the British Virgin Islands with the arrest on an American indictment of the Prime Minister. The head of customs is on gardening leave whilst being investigated. As I say, the trial of alleged offences of the Prime Minister is due this summer as well. So, and that's one small case. But all those activities enable all kinds of illicit activity and illicit financial flows to develop. And as I said at the very beginning, one of the key motivating factors for organised crime is illicit finance as well, but also that finance then feeds into other forms of illicit activity such as terrorism as well. So now what that does then is it means that it diverts funds from communities. It creates a place that, again, I mentioned this in my presentation, but in many Latin American states, the criminal groups, the belligerent forces are the go-to state rather than necessarily the sovereign state itself. And what that means then is there's a complete breakdown in law and order. And perhaps one of the worst cases that we encountered at the moment is Haiti, which is nothing more than a narco state at this moment in time. And so it's extremely frightening prospect if that is allowed to get to grip, is allowed to take a hold in other places as well. And I would suggest that we're not too far off that as well. So quite a gloomy picture emerges from that. And there are some, as I say, there are some players in this area that are doing what they can in order to stop that from happening. In particular, the Americans bring a huge presence and force because Latin America's on their is effectively their backyard, etc. But and some other European countries as well, I think punch well above their weight. But it does require a greater effort and greater upskilling and capability of host law enforcement to be able to deal with it than I actually think is practicable at this time. So.
Thank you, Keith. And I did just want to give a little bit of a kind of shout out to some of the work that RUSI's Centre for Financial Crime has done specifically in relation to terrorism financing on the far right side, including looking at whether issues of far right financing and how that operates and how we understand it is whether it's compatible with our current counterterrorism financing regime. So definitely lots more for those of you that are interested on the RUSI website, done by other teams at RUSI as well. Hans, I'm going to turn over to you for some final remarks, either on that or anything else that you just want to flag before I wrap us up.
Yeah, I mean, look, just a final remark that we are releasing a report on the cooperation of right-wing extremism and organized crime next week in the Foreign Ministry in Berlin, because it was done on behalf of the Foreign Ministry, and then publicly on the 29th in the webinar. And of course, I'd be happy to welcome anyone who wants to join for the presentation. It looks at 6 different countries, all European and the US. 7 different countries in Europe and the US, including the Balkans, but also Western Europe, as well as Eastern Europe. And you can see a similar system here, that you have a full range of what I called terrorist crime convergent here as well. So people are not just extremists, they can also be organized crime. And in some cases, Terrorism in Germany, a couple of groups in Poland, you actually had a full transformation. It started as, the Terrorism started as the main organizer of festivals and music producers. They managed bands and made hundreds of thousands, but then in late 2019, they switched to drugs and became very quickly a drug trafficking network of significance in East Germany, all while cooperating with the people they usually hate, i.e. foreigners that were supplying the drugs to them. So when it comes to money, ideological ideas only go so far.
Wonderful. I'm going to wrap us up there because, I mean, I am really impressed. We've had a really engaged set of attendees with some excellent comments and questions. We've covered a lot of ground, which I am not going to try and wrap us up in that. I am very interested in that report that Hans has mentioned. And I know when we discussed what you were going to talk about, it could have been that, and it could have been the Taliban and Afghanistan, and we felt that maybe Afghanistan and the Taliban was more appropriate for this session, but definitely more to speak of in this space. So I would love to thank Dr. Hans-Jakob Schindler and Dr. Keith Ditcham for their contributions today. And I would like to thank all of the attendees, not only for attending this session, but for people who've attended the previous sessions of this seminar series. This is by no means, I hope, the last engagement between the CIVAD Centre and RUSI. So please do keep an eye out on the CIVAD and RUSI Terrorism and Conflict web pages. Really grateful to the CIVAD Centre at SOAS for requesting and asking and working with us at RUSI here on this. And if I'm allowed to have a final word, because I think we're doing a bit of PR, if everyone could take a look and keep an eye out for RUSI's new podcast, which is launched by the Terrorism and Conflict Research Group, which is called Decoding Counterterrorism, where some of these issues are covered that we've looked at today, particularly the intersection of conflict development and terrorism. And it is available on Spotify and on the RUSI webpage. And that is definitely probably enough from me. Thank you all. Have a good rest of the day and a good evening wherever you are. Thank you.